and welcome back to Your Views on the News. Now, in the first half, we were talking about Egypt and the election of Mohamed Morsi as the president of Egypt. Now, we want to move on to our next story, which is about this Foreign Office-backed study, a report by a group of British lawyers that found a spiraling case of injustice against Palestinian child prisoners. Now, before we talk about this subject a little bit more, here's a short clip to remind the viewers.
The belief that every Palestinian child is a potential terrorist may be leading Israel to what's been described as a spiral of injustice and to breaches of international law. This is the damning conclusion of a report funded by the UK Foreign Office. The Foreign Office has revealed that it's to challenge Israel over its treatment of child prisoners. The move comes after the report, Children in Military Custody, detailed claims of routine abuse of Palestinian youths by Israel. The report was compiled by a delegation of senior British lawyers, which revealed harsh practices such as hooding and the use of leg irons. It is thought to be the first investigation of this kind, and showed how Palestinian children as young as 12 were treated when arrested. The shocking report detailed claims that youngsters are dragged from their beds in the middle of the night, have their wrists bound behind their backs, and are blindfolded and made to kneel or lie face down in military vehicles. Children from the West Bank are held in conditions that could amount to torture, such as solitary confinement, with little or no access to their parents. They can also be forced to stay awake before being verbally as well as physically abused and coerced into signing confessions they cannot read. The report was based on a visit to Israel and the West Bank last September, which was funded and facilitated by the Foreign Office and the British Consulate in Jerusalem. The team, led by Sir Stephen Sedley, a former Court of Appeal judge, heard that every Palestinian child is treated like a potential terrorist. It concluded that there were repeated breach of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, which prohibits cruel, inhuman and degrading treatment, and to which Israel is a signatory. In conclusion, the report says, it may be that much of the reluctance to treat Palestinian children in conformity with international norms stems from a belief, which was advanced to us by a military prosecutor, that every Palestinian child is a potential terrorist. Such a stance seems to us to be the starting point of a spiral of injustice. Israel has said it would study the report's recommendations as part of what it described as its ongoing efforts to find the most appropriate balance between preventing violence and treating perpetrators with humanity. In a statement, the Israeli embassy in London said it appreciated the delegation's efforts to learn about the challenges involved in dealing with minors involved in acts of militancy and violence. Regrettably, such activities continue to be encouraged by official Palestinian textbooks and television programs which glorify terrorism and suicide terrorists. As a result, under 18-year-olds are frequently involved in lethal acts, with the Palestinian Authority unable or unwilling to meet its obligation to investigate and prosecute these offences. Israel has no choice but to do so itself.
Well, on the phone to discuss this is Dr. Dawood Abdalali, Director of Middle East Monitor. Assalamu alaikum, Dawood.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.
Jazakallah khair for joining me this evening. Now, this report, damning as it may seem and sound, is there anything new in there that we didn't know about?
No, not at all. Actually, Israel has a very long history of maltreatment of Palestinian children. We can go back to the first Intifada in 1987, when the then Prime Minister Rabin, gave instructions that don't kill them but break their bones with clubs. And over 90,000 children were, wounded and disabled during that uprising. And then we go to 2000 when, Mohammed Dura was killed, shot in the arms of his father in Gaza. Very horrific, crimes against young children. The case of Iman Hadjout, a baby who was shot in the chest. So there is a history of abuse. And although the report by, and the initiative by the Foreign Office is indeed welcome, and marks a step in the right direction, human rights organizations have been, pointing this out for years. There is the Geneva-based Directorate for Child International, they've catalogued these abuses for many years now.
And you mentioned Muhammad Durra, and I actually vividly remember actually watching this horrific act. And if you look at the response from the Israelis, which is that every Palestinian child is a potential terrorist.
Well, this is really outrageous, and it cannot stand the test of reason or logic by any standards, legal, moral, or political. These are kids who throw stones. If an Israeli child threw a stone, he would not be treated this way. In fact, when an Israeli kid is arrested, he has to be released within 48 hours. And then you give him you give a Palestinian kid a document in Hebrew which he doesn't understand. Some of these kids in the report, the intro by yourselves said, well, they're taken from their homes. In fact, some are taken from playing grounds. Some are taken from their schools.
Well, let me bring Patrick into the discussion. I mean, what did you make of this report?
Well, I know a lot about this subject because I've been following the Palestinian issue for many years, very active on the side of charities and so forth via London over the years. And, and I've seen refugee camps in Lebanon. And, this is nothing new for me. And my attitude with this is to the Foreign Office, better late than never. However, the reality is the persecution of Palestinians, particularly young men, is institutional in Israel. This has been going on for decades, okay? And the reason they do this is also, it's not because they're potential terrorists. And I know Palestinians my age who were imprisoned when they were 12 and 13 for throwing stones or for printing flyers. And the reason Israeli government does this as a policy, because they're fettering out future leaders. They're not just fettering out future terrorists. That's the excuse they give you. But at the end of the day, that country's under occupation. It's much more violent and it's much more repressive than South Africa ever was, and physically as well. And really, what they're doing in Israel and why the West has turned a blind eye to it. 2 sets of rules in the UN, 2 sets of rules with human rights, 1 set for Israel and 1 for the rest of the world. They'll scramble NATO jets just on a shaky cell phone video in Tripoli, or fake reports coming out of Syria, which we'll get into later. And this has been going on in Israel and Palestine for generations. So it's really sad.
Well, let me bring Dawood back in. Dawood, I mean, the strangest thing in all of this, in many of these reports, is we still don't get to appreciate the context that these Palestinians live in, which is that they're occupied people. And this is never mentioned. So, the fact that, they're referred to as terrorists, militants and everything else, there's no explanation given behind that.
Indeed, and some of them are taken to military courts outside of the occupied territories, which is a clear breach of international humanitarian law. And of what purpose it is to try a young kid before a military court for throwing stones? As I said.
Well, Patrick has said that it is actually to stifle any future leadership, basically. It is to stop the resistance.
Well, this is so, indeed. But, today in the West Bank, there's no real resistance as you had, let's say, 10 years ago. There's no armed resistance in the West Bank today. Let's be very truthful to ourselves. It has been crushed. And thanks to the cooperation by the Ramallah authorities with the Israelis. And they have a lot to blame for what is happening. If they stop the so-called security coordination with Israel and protect their people, we would have less of these abuses. It's time that they put an end to this coordination, so-called security coordination.
Do you agree with this point
Yeah,
that Dawood's making?
I do. You know, but all this comes back to, if you've been following the Palestinian issue and you know how bad it's been for so long and how many rules and violations being broken. I had a conversation with an IDF veteran who is a brilliant writer and a brilliant artist. His name is Gilad Atzmon. And I interviewed him for another show. And I talked about the Palestinian issue, and he's been a massive champion for Palestinian rights and to end the occupation. As an Israeli, he's been a champion. So he hasn't been attacked as easily by the Israeli lobby and so forth. He said to me, he shook his head. He says, you know what? The thing about Palestine is, you know, we allow this stuff to go on in our own country. He's a British citizen. This stuff goes on in Britain. There's people being abused, being locked up without trial in this country. In America, Guantanamo has been sitting there for 10 years. He says, if in the West, if we can't sort out this issue in our own country, how can we expect to even want it to be fixed in Palestine? And I think if you look at the way that the trend has gone in Europe and North America towards a police state, you can see that it's becoming more and more critical for the Palestinians, because how can we fight for someone over there when we're losing our rights at home? Very important point, which was made to me by him.
Okay, Dawood, just on a final point, now this report has come out. It is, like you said, damning and welcomed. But what really are your expectations from this, from the British government, and what do you really think is going to happen?
Well, you know, I don't have high expectations from the British government. You know, it has. You know, this is a government that has accommodated war crime suspects. It's changed the laws on universal jurisdiction so that these suspects can come to Britain. So we should not, you know, hang our hopes very high. But it underscores, you know, the wide gap between what we say and what we do. If this were to happen in Africa, if an African state, take for example Joseph Kony and his gang in Uganda and the maltreatment of children, there's an international warrant out for him, you see, for his abuse of children. Now, these kids in Palestine have been abused for generations, and no one is making an effort. So, yes, you put it on the books and you record it, but we have to go a step further. And there are many things that can be done. You know, first of all, international warrants, you know, freezing of bank accounts, no travel to the United Kingdom, trade sanctions. A lot can be done. We are in a position to do it. But, of course, the government would not do it if it is not pressured, and the public has to respond.
Okay. Well, Dawood Abdallah, thank you for joining me this evening. Just moving on, Patrick. You know, we want to talk about Syria, and we haven't really got that much time. Now, the situation in Syria, it is quite dire. Bashar al-Assad has, in all intents and purposes, said that there is actually a civil war taking place. And, you know, this Kofi Annan plan, it seems like Russia is getting a little bit more warmed to the idea. Is there a peaceful solution to this?
You know, I think when you look at Syria, I know it's a cliche, but I just go back to Libya. And when you have a guerrilla force and guerrilla fighters, foreign fighters, in the case of Syria, from Libya on record, from Saudi Arabia, from other Gulf states, you know, being armed and being given financial and logistic support from Western intelligence agencies and bodies, then if you do that for a year, eventually, no matter what you want to happen in that country, it's going to be destabilized. And it's gone past the point of no return. It makes me very sad to say this, because I really held out hope that things would calm down there and that would stabilize. But the fact of the matter is, a lot of you viewers may or may not know, there's a meeting called the Bilderberg meeting, which happened 3 weeks ago in Chantilly, Virginia. And this is the steering committee of the Council on Foreign Relations, and Chatham House, and all the major banks are there, and the captains of industry and politics. They map out the agenda for the next year. The Syrian National Council's envoy, a woman, was there, and she signed off on the Syrian deal. They're going to balkanize that country when they're done with it. It's going to be divided by religious and by ethnic sects.
Right.
So that's the plan for Syria, because the West does not like the fact that Syria is nationalistic. Syrians are proud to be Syrians. They're a self-sufficient economy. That's going to go by the wayside. They have a state bank. They have zero debt. They're in the black. That's going to finish. Okay, when the Assad government falls, like Assad or not, I'm not his biggest fan, but I don't like to see the country destroyed in this way, and most Syrians would agree.
Yeah, it is true, and it is very hard to read the situation. But you know, some of the suffering that Assad has brought into his own people is also unforgivable. And you, I don't know if you do, but you can appreciate the cry of desperation, because you know what else can they do? And to be honest, a lot of the Syrians, what they're asking for is not for foreign intervention. They're just asking for help so that they can deal with the situation themselves.
Yeah, but it's a rigged game at the end of the day, because you have Britain, you have British military advisors. This has just come out of DEPCA file report online. They're British military advisors in Syria right now. Maybe they've been there for months. American advisors as well over the Turkish border. Turkey has been given safe haven to the Free Syrian Army. And a lot of the people in the Free Syrian Army are not Syrians. Okay, they are Al-Qaeda type freedom fighter, mercenary types who get deployed.
But this Al-Qaeda label is bandied about quite easily, though.
Yeah, well, it's
anyone you don't
brand.
like is Al-Qaeda.
No, but it's a brand. But see, America is backing that force, which makes me think that it's more authentic Al-Qaeda, because they're only backing them for a reason, because there's a certain outcome that Washington and London want in Damascus, because in order for them to move towards Iran, the path to Persia is through Syria, because when Syria falls, Lebanon...
You think Iran's the main goal?
Absolutely. From a geopolitical standpoint, and again, I don't like this to be true, but I've been looking at it, and a lot of people have been looking at it the last couple of months. And in order for Syria when Syria destabilizes, Lebanon could destabilize in a matter of weeks. Okay, Hezbollah is the only thing standing between Israel doing a joint strike on Iran. Right. Once they're eliminated, the door for Iran is open. And that's a very dangerous thing for everybody. And I really hope it doesn't happen, but the indications are that that's the way they're going.
Well, Patrick, thank you for joining me this evening, and apologies, we have run out of time. Hope you enjoyed the discussions. Inshallah, we will be covering many of the same issues probably next week, but hopefully with a lot more time. See you next week. Assalamu alaikum.
Welcome to the Grill Restaurant. We take great pride in serving you fresh, high-quality